Iran is losing this war without having fired a single missile at American territory. And the most revealing part is that the regime itself already knows it. While Tehran keeps up its rhetoric of resistance, its energy economy is collapsing in real time. Its regional allies are turning their backs, and its own Supreme National Security Council has put in writing a conclusion that reads less like a defense strategy and more like a countdown to surrender. The situation is escalating rapidly, and the window left for the Iranian regime is narrowing week by week. The president of one of the most oil-rich nations on earth just went on state television to beg his citizens to turn off their lights. Not 10 lights, too. That image tells you everything you need to know about what is happening inside Iran right now. And before this analysis is over, you are going to understand exactly how the blockade works, why Tehran has no plan C left, and which of the three endgame scenarios is already in motion. Picture this: Chabahar Port, Iran's coastline, a terminal that under normal conditions handles 5 ships per day. Today there are more than 20 tankers sitting motionless at anchor, loaded with crude oil that has nowhere to go. In the Gulf of Oman, U.S. Marines from the 3rd Expeditionary Corps are rappelling from helicopters onto a Comoros-flagged freighter called the MBTA Star 3. The ship is boarded, inspected, and eventually released. But the message it sends requires no translation. And in an emergency session room in Tehran, the Supreme National Security Council is writing a document that will be leaked within hours. A document dated April 30th, 2026, that reads less like a strategy paper and more like an internal autopsy. That leak is where this story truly begins, because what the Council wrote changes the entire frame of this crisis. The Supreme National Security Council convened under emergency conditions and presided over by Mohammad Bakr Sulkadir reached 3 conclusions. First, popular protests could resume within days due to economic pressure. Second, the regime can withstand the blockade for a maximum of 6 to 8 weeks. Third, by the end of spring, nearly 2 million jobs in the private sector could be lost. Security officials summarized everything in a single sentence: social unrest is inevitable, only the date it erupts remains uncertain. Understand what you are looking at. This is not a CIA assessment. This is not a Western think tank projection. This is the regime's own security apparatus, writing down in its own words that the streets can be lost in weeks. When the system that exists to protect the government concludes in writing that the government may not survive, that is not a crisis. That is the beginning of a collapse. Now let us go back to the mechanism producing that collapse, because it operates with a precision that is worth understanding in full detail. The naval blockade the United States is maintaining in the Strait of Hormuz is not a symbolic maneuver. It is an economic tourniquet applied directly to Iran's main revenue artery, and the results are already catastrophic. According to Kepler Maritime Analysis data, Iran's daily oil exports collapsed from 1.85 million barrels to just 567,000 in the 2 weeks following the start of the blockade. That is a 70% reduction in export volume, a financial hemorrhage of approximately $1 billion per month. These are not theoretical projections. Tehran is losing that money right now in real time. The logistical consequences compound that bleeding. Iran has between 12 and 22 days of available storage capacity before its facilities become completely saturated. Once that threshold is crossed, the regime will be forced to cut production by at least an additional 1.5 million barrels per day. And here is where something critical must be underlined. This is not just a temporary revenue loss. In petroleum engineering, there is a concept called irreversible production loss, and that is exactly what is happening. Wells that are forcibly shut down under these conditions do not always recover their previous output. Estimates point to a permanent loss of between 300,000 and 500,000 barrels per day, even if the blockade were lifted tomorrow. Iran is not only losing today's revenues, it is mortgaging its energy infrastructure for the next several decades. At Chabahar, the only significant export terminal Iran possessed outside the Strait of Hormuz, its carefully built Plan B, the situation is chaotic. More than 20 tankers stranded, no exit in sight. And crucially, Iran has no Plan C. There is no third escape route. There is no backup pipeline. There is no alternative corridor that the U.S. Navy is not already watching. Now here is what transforms this blockade from a pressure tactic into a strategic earthquake. It is not just what the United States is doing. It is the chain of regional decisions that are accelerating the damage simultaneously. The most impactful move came from the United Arab Emirates. Abu Dhabi has announced its exit from OPEC, a decision that in this specific context carries enormous consequences. The reason is the Chabahar and Fujairah pipeline, a 380-kilometer line that carries crude directly to the Gulf of Oman without touching the Strait of Hormuz at any point. Since the escalation began, exports through Fujairah have surged 57%, reaching nearly 1.9 million barrels per day. By leaving OPEC, the UAE can now inject up to an additional million barrels per day into global markets, freed from every production quota that previously constrained it. This dismantles the entire foundation of Iran's strategic argument. For decades, Tehran built its leverage around one central premise: pressure us and we close Hormuz and the world stops. But the world is not stopping. The UAE is opening an alternative artery large enough to compensate for a significant portion of Iranian volume. And in doing so, it is sending a geopolitical message that is impossible to misread. Tehran's energy blackmail no longer functions as a lever of regional power. The consequences for Iran are twofold and simultaneous. First, export volume collapses. Second, the surge in supply coming through Fujairah drives global oil prices downward. Until now, OPEC production quotas kept prices high enough that Iranian crude sold through shadow networks still generated meaningful revenue even under sanctions. With lower prices, that margin disappears entirely. Iran is suffering a defeat in volume and a defeat in price per barrel at the same time. It is a loss on both fronts at once. India's reaction confirms how completely the regional calculus has shifted. New Delhi had spent years developing the Chabahar port infrastructure as its gateway into the north-south international transport corridor, the China-Russia-backed alternative to Western trade routes. India has just frozen its entire investment in that project and signed a new contract with the Fujairah Shipping Authority instead. One of Iran's main strategic partners in Asia is literally jumping ship because doing business with Tehran has become a calculated risk that no one is willing to absorb anymore. This is not just a commercial loss. It is an accelerated erosion of Iranian geopolitical weight at a speed that has no precedent in recent decades. The external signals match what the internal documents are already saying. President Pezeshkian appearing on state television to ask citizens to switch on 2 lights instead of 10. Government offices running on half-day schedules. Heating cut intermittently in the Tehran metro. Street lighting hauled in Isfahan and Tehran. The real sitting at $1.8 million per dollar. Annual inflation above 40%. Lines growing for bread, meat, and milk. Imported medicine prices up nearly 60%. The president of a country with some of the largest oil reserves on the planet is asking his people to turn off the lights. There is no more eloquent image of systemic failure. And this is where something needs to be said that rarely gets enough attention. This crisis did not begin with the blockade. Its roots run deeper into a political choice the regime made across several decades to direct an enormous share of oil revenues not toward its own population, but toward financing a regional proxy network. Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, Shia militias in Iraq, armed groups in Syria. That entire architecture of influence had a price tag, and that price was paid by the Iranian citizen in the form of deteriorating infrastructure/public services and an economy that never approached its real potential. Now that the funding artery is being severed, the effects are hitting both ends simultaneously. In Iran, people cannot afford bread. In Lebanon, Hezbollah cannot pay salaries. In Yemen, the Houthis are burning through their last drone reserves. In Iraq, the militias are withdrawing from the field because the money has stopped arriving. The regime is losing in weeks a network of influence it spent 40 years constructing. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bent was explicit in a statement that carries historic weight. Iran's oil pumping capacity is on the verge of collapse, and a real gasoline shortage inside the country could emerge in the very near future. An oil-producing nation with its own citizens lining up for fuel is one of the most severe paradoxes in modern geopolitical history. Days after that statement, satellite imagery published by the Department of Defense confirmed that Iran is using decommissioned vessels as floating crude storage. Ships in questionable navigational condition, unable to put to sea, repurposed as warehouses for oil that has nowhere else to go. Hormuz is under blockade. Chabahar is sealed. Fujairah belongs to the UAE. The exits are closing one by one. The military dimension of this operation deserves clarity. This is not a diplomatic pressure campaign with a symbolic naval presence attached. It is a physical containment. Sanctions could be evaded. Tankers turned off transponders, changed flags, conducted mid-ocean cargo transfers against a physical blockade. None of those tactics function. On April 28, 2026, the MBTA Star 3 was intercepted in the Gulf of Oman. Marines rappelled from helicopters and boarded it for a full inspection. The ship was released. No Iranian port calls confirmed. But the message was impossible to misread. No vessel approaches Iran without the permission of the United States Navy. Insurance companies have canceled all Hormuz route policies. Tanker operators have eliminated Iranian routes from their schedules. Asian buyers have exited the Iranian supply market entirely because a naval boarding is no longer a hypothetical. It is a standard operational procedure. To place this in perspective, the world has not seen a physical blockade of this scale in more than 50 years. The Cuban Missile Crisis naval blockade was brief. The partial blockades of Yugoslavia were largely symbolic. Maritime pressure on North Korea had limited reach. What is unfolding off Iran's coastline in 2026 is in a different category altogether. It is a total legal and military siege, combining naval presence, permanent satellite surveillance through Sentinel-2 systems, continuous aerial patrols, and full coordination with the Gulf's main regional allies. When Tehran responded, offering to reopen Hormuz while deferring the nuclear issue to future negotiations, Washington rejected the proposal almost without consideration. Trump dismissed it without hesitation. That response reveals everything about the nature of the American calculation. The objective is not a tactical pause. The objective is a verifiable strategic surrender on the nuclear program. The blockade is the mechanism to force it. What comes next can develop across three possible scenarios. In the first, the regime agrees to negotiate its nuclear program without preconditions. Trump signs a comprehensive agreement in exchange for lifting the blockade. Iran exits the crisis with a massive political defeat, but with the state still standing. The complication, the Revolutionary Guards could read that outcome as a betrayal, generating severe internal fractures within the regime itself. In the second scenario, the regime holds out, protests erupt, economic collapse and social unrest reinforce each other. The regime responds with the kind of brutal crackdown it has deployed before, but repression carries an international political cost that compounds an isolation already approaching totality. In the third scenario, the United States executes a direct military operation. CENTCOM plans for striking Iran's nuclear infrastructure and Revolutionary Guard installations already exist. If that scenario is activated, Iran faces a defeat of a severity that dwarfs either of the other two. For 47 years since the 1979 revolution, Tehran built its survival on one word: resistance. It claimed it had never collapsed, that every external pressure had been converted into strength. But there is a qualitative difference between resisting sanctions and resisting a physical blockade. Sanctions leave gaps. A destroyer in the shipping lane leaves none. And the regime's own security apparatus is now putting that reality in writing. The myth of the Iranian resistance economy is not being dismantled from Washington. It is being dismantled from within by the documents the regime's own officials are writing behind closed doors. The question is no longer whether Iran will yield. The question is in what form and on what timeline. 6 to 8 weeks is the window that Iran's own Security Council estimates it can hold. The clock is already running, and every day that passes, Tehran's room to maneuver shrinks a little more. Which scenario do you think plays out first? A negotiated deal, a popular uprising, or a direct military strike? And how many weeks do you give the regime before something breaks? Drop your read in the comments below. If this kind of deep-sourced geopolitical analysis is what you are here for, subscribe and hit the notification bell, because the next video covers the 3 real endgame scenarios for this war in full detail, including the one the Pentagon is already preparing for in silence. See you there.